Hi friends, welcome to Taming Python series. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use forms with basic front-end and server-side validation in Flask web applications. So why do people use forms in web applications? Forms are used in web applications to take user inputs. For example, this is a simple form where we are taking the details of name, phone, and email from a user from the browser. Alright, let's get started with coding and try to create a form like this and try to perform validations over this form. So I'm going to take a blank folder. I'm going to open it with VS Code. I'll just create a new file and just name it server.py, and this will be the Flask web server which we are going to create. And if you don't know what the Flask server is, or if you don't know the basics of Flask server, I've created a playlist on Python Flask web server development and Python Flask Jinja templates. I'll leave the link of those videos in the description, so please go through those videos if you don't know the basics of Flask and Jinja templating. So let's try to create a basic Flask web server. So first I'm going to import the Flask object from Flask module. So I'll just write from Flask import Flask, and then let's try to create an instance of a Flask web server. So I'll just write app equal to Flask and give the name of this file as the input. Then I'm going to run this server. So I'm just going to write app.run. I'm going to make this run at the local host. So I'll just write host equal to 0.0.0.0. That means it will listen at localhost, and then the port of the Flask web server will be 5000. You can name any port you want, so I'm just using port 5000 in this example, and I'm going to write debug equal to true so that I can easily debug the Flask server errors. Alright, now we have set up the server. Now let's set up a root handler that serves the home page. So let me try to create a root handler. So I'll just write a definition index. Here it's going to return a template, so I'm going to return, and here I'm going to use the render template which I'll import from the Flask module. So I'll just write here render template, and I'm going to use this render template function to render a template called home.html.j2, which I'm going to create in a while. And this function doesn't serve as a root handler unless you add a decorator to it. So I'm just going to write app.route, and here the route is going to be the normal home page, so I'm just going to write slash. So now this function serves as a route handler when the application is hit at the home page. But I don't have the home.html.j2, right? So let's try to create this home.html.j2 in the templates folder. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name it this folder as templates. And in this templates folder, I'm going to create a new file which is home.html.j2, and this can be a simple HTML. So I'm just going to write a simple HTML like hello world. So this is our home.html.j2. It's just a simple HTML which says hello world from Jinja template. So now that's it. Our server is ready. So let's try to run this server now. So now since the server is running, I'm going to open a new tab, and I'm going to open the URL localhost 5000, and here you can see the hello world from Jinja template being output because it's present in the home.html.j2 template. So now we got our basic server up and running. So in home.html.j2, let's try to create a form and display it in the browser. So first I'm going to create a small heading. I'll just write hi, please fill this form, and let's try to create a form. So a form in HTML can be created using the form tag, and you want to say that the method is equal to post, because once the user submit the form, it has to be sent as a post request to the same page. In order to make the label and form input align perfectly, I'm going to use the HTML table so that all the inputs and all the labels are in the same line. So first I'm going to create a table, and in the table I'm going to create a row, and in that row I'm going to create two columns. One column will be for the label, and another column will be for the user input. Let's try to create another row which gives the submit button. So I'm just going to copy this row, paste it here, and instead of creating a two columns, I'm just going to create one column, and in that one column I'm going to place a button where the text is going to be something like submit, and the type of this button should be submit, because when you click a button of type submit, then the form will get submitted automatically. Alright, now we got a very simple form inside a table. The first row of the table will be the label and the name input, and the next row will be the submit button. So let me try to save this form and save this server again so that my server will get reloaded, and reload this again. So here you can see I've got a label and an input and a submit button. Alright, let's try to create another rows also. So I'm just going to copy this row for taking the name and paste it here, and instead of name I'm going to take the phone number. I'm going to name the input type as number, and another row will be created for the email. So I'm just going to name the phone as email and type equal to email. So we got three rows in our form, and each row has a column for label and the input to be taken from the user. So let me try to save this form again, and let me try to reload our output, and here you can see about the name, phone, and email inputs which can be entered by the user. Alright, this is how you can create a simple form in HTML. Let's try to create some basic HTML form validations. If you want to make this name input as mandatory, you can just add an attribute called required. So using the required attribute makes the form input to be required before submitting the form. So I'm just going to save this, and if I just reload the page, and if I keep this name input empty and submit, you're going to get the browser warning suggesting to keep the input field as not empty. So this is how you can do some basic input validations in the front end out of the box using HTML standards. So if you want to make this input to be required, you can add the HTML tag required. And if you want to make the input to be at least 4 characters, so you can write another HTML attribute called min length is equal to 4. So let's try to save this again and reload this page and write the name as just A. And if I just click this, you can see please use at least 4 characters. You are currently using 1 character. So the browser is doing the validations out of the box using some HTML attributes. The same way I can declare these 2 inputs also as required by using these required attributes in this HTML inputs. And suppose if you want to make the phone to have a minimum number something like 10,000, so I can write minimum equal to this 1 lakh. And if I just save this and reload this output again and keep the name as ABCD and phone number as a small number, and just click submit, you can see the warning saying that the value should not be less than 1 lakh. So let's try to fill a big number. If I just keep this email field as blank and submit, it's going to tell fill out this field. And if I just write something else and click this, it's not getting submitted because it is not a valid email address as per HTML standard. So if I just write something@something.com and submit, now the form is submitted and it is telling that this method is not allowed for the requested URL. Because when I click the submit button, a post request is being sent to the same page because I have written form method equals to post. So now in our server.py at the home page, you have only the get request handler. You did not mention the handler for the post request. So further in the root handler decorator, you can just write methods equal to get and post. So by mentioning methods equal to get and post, your root handler can handle both the get request and post request. By default, any root handler will only handle the get request. That's why our form was not getting submitted because we don't have any root handler, right? But now since we told that the methods equal to get and post, this root handler can handle both the post request and the get request. So if I just save the server again and reload this, and let's try to submit this now, you can see the form is got submitted and the same page is being loaded. Because when we submitted the form, this root handler was triggered and the template was returned. Alright, now we have successfully wired up a form and submitted it to the server. But how can our server read the form inputs? Further, first you need to name the inputs for the server to differentiate between different inputs. Further, you can use the name attribute. So I'm going to use the name equal to username and name equal to phone here, user phone, and name equal to user email, and save it. In this form, I'm naming each input using the name HTML attribute, and I'm giving a unique name to each form input. So this way, when you submit the form, and if the form data is submitted to the server can differentiate between each form input and extract the data from it for processing. So let me try to save this form, and in the server.py, let's try to print out each form input in the console when the form is submitted. But how can you differentiate if the root handler is triggered by a get request or a post request? So further, I'm going to import another submodule from Flask called request, and using this request dot method inside a root handler, you can get to know whether the request was triggered by a post request or a get request. So if I just write if request dot method equal to post and write something inside this if condition, this condition will be triggered only for the post request. So let's try to print the form data here. When the request dot method is post, that means if the form is submitted, this method will be triggered. And inside this method, I'm going to write print request dot form of username, the input name which I have set in the form, and I'm going to use the same thing for user phone and email. And just instead of printing, I'm going to write some extra thing like user equal to, and here I'm going to write the phone number equal to, and here I'm going to write the email equal to. So this is how I'm going to extract the form contents in the post request handler of the server. I'm going to use the request.form and call the form input by name, and using this method you can extract the form inputs. So here I'm just extracting the form inputs to just print them. So here I'm using print user equal to request.form of username, because you can see in the form the name of the form input was username, uname. So I'm just using the same name here. And for the phone, here the name of the input is uphone, so I'm just writing the uphone. And for email, the name of the input is you email, so I'm just using request.form of you email. So this way I'm taking the user input from the front end in the back end while processing in the post request handler using the request.form. So request.form is just like a Python dictionary which contains all your form inputs, and the key for each form input will be the name of the form input in the HTML. So let's try to save the server again and reload this, and let's try to write some name, some phone number and some email address, and let's try to submit this. And nothing is shown in the browser, but here in the server you can see user equal to phone equal to email equal to is being printed in the server, and this input is being taken from the front end, right? So this way you can create a post request handler or the form submission handler in your root handler by first specifying the methods equal to get post, so that the root handler will be triggered for the post request also. And inside the root handler you can use the request.method to differentiate if the root handler is triggered by a post request or a get request. And if the request.method is post, you can access the form contents using the request.form dictionary, and each form input can be differentiated by the name attribute which was given in the form, just like name equal to uname, and here in the server.py you can write request.form uname. So in my scenario I'm just printing it, but in your scenario you can use the form input and save the form input to a database and redirect the user to another page or something like that. Alright, so that's it guys. This is how you can create a basic form with basic front-end validation and get the form inputs at the server side. Alright, this is how you can do front-end validation. But what if I want to do validation at the server side? I mean, why do you want to require to do validation in the server side? Because the browser is not in the control of the server. User can use some JavaScript or change the HTML in the browser to submit form or bypass validations in the front end. So for this reason, server-side validation is important if you want to increase the security of your forms. And if you want to validate your form inputs with some complex algorithms like checking it with the database or doing some complex validations, in that case also you can do server-side validations. So let's try to create a simple scenario where I want to do form validation on this input called username. Let's say I want this user input to be starting with an alphabet, and if it starts with any number or special character, I don't want to submit this form. So let's try to do the server-side form validation for this scenario. So let's try to access the username here. I'm just writing username equal to request.form of username. So I'm just going to copy this request.form of username inside a variable. Let me try to check if the first character of the username is an alphabet. So that can be done by using username of 0. So this will give the first character of the username, and I'm going to call is alpha. So this is going to be true if the first word of this username is an alphabet. So I'm going to write if not username of 0 is alpha. If the first letter of the username is not an alphabet, this if condition will be triggered. So if the first letter of the username is not an alphabet, I'm going to create an error. So further, to store the errors, I'm going to create a dictionary called errors, and in the dictionary of errors, I'm going to say for this username input, this is the list of errors, and the list of errors is username should start with the alphabet. So here I've created an errors object, and if I have some errors for each input, with each input name as a key, I'm going to populate a list of errors. So here in my case, since the username is not valid for me, I'm going to write errors of username equal to list of errors, which is only one error, which is username should start with an alphabet. And inside the render template, I'm going to pass another object called errors, and the value of this object will be the errors variable. So now in my template, I'm even rendering the errors which I have computed in the server side. So now since the errors are passed to my front end, let's try to show those errors. So if there are errors in this form, let's try to show them in a list. So I'm just going to create an unordered list here, and using a simple for loop in Jinja, I'm going to iterate over the errors. So in the errors object, I'm going to iterate over the uname key for the username input errors, and for each error, I'm going to create a list item which just displays the errors. So let's recap what we've done. We have validated whether the username is valid or not, and populated the errors object with some messages if the username is not valid. And in the front end, using the errors object which has been passed by the server, I'm just rendering the errors object at the appropriate place so that the user can know what errors were rendered by the server. So let me try to save this. Let's try to reload our server again. So again my form is rendered, and let's try to enter some inputs here, and let's try to start the name with a number and just submit here. I've got name, I've got E here because I did not use the double brackets for rendering the error here. So let's try to save this template again and reload this, and let's try to write some inputs and submit. And here you can see username should start with an alphabet. The list is coming above the name because I've just created a small mistake where I did not enclose this inside the cell. So here the unordered list should be inside the table cell, and now if I just save it, and run this again and write some invalid name and then submit, you can see the error for name input is being shown here. So this way, using an errors object and processing the form inputs, I was able to do server-side validation and able to show errors to the users using Jinja templating. So this is how you can do server-side validation. But hey, after submitting the wrong input, you have to type the inputs all over again. So how can I avoid this? Here you can give the value equal to request.form of the input tag. So let's see what's happening here. Here in the input tag, I'm giving value equal to request.form of username. So after your post request, while rendering the form, request.form still contains the data of the form inputs. So you can use the request.form object and render the previous form submission values using the value equal to request.form tag and render it in your output. So let's try to copy this value equal to HTML attributes here also, and the name of this is phone, so form of user phone, and the name of this input is user email. So that's it. So using value equal to request.form inside the Jinja template, I'm going to get the previous form inputs also. So let's try to save this form and try to reload this again, and let's try to enter some invalid name and some phone number and email, and now we just click submit. You can see the form data is fetched from the server again, so that you can correct your form mistakes and then submit valid form input. But hey, while showing the errors, it looks like it's too much big. So if I want to control the styling, I can just use some simple HTML syntax for CSS classes, something like this: li class equal to error, and here I can create some simple CSS class like using the style tag. I can just say that the error class has some styling like font size is smaller and the color is red. So let me try to save this and reload our form again, and let's try to give some invalid form inputs, and if I submit, you can see I've got a smaller error message and red color. So you can even further style your error messages using simple CSS classes. So we have just displayed errors for the username input. I can just copy this same thing and display errors for all the other inputs also. So inside the TD, which is the table cell, I want to copy paste this, and this is errors of user phone, and this is for errors of user email, and that's it. I'm displaying the server-side errors for each form input now. So this is how you can perform simple server-side form input validation and display errors using Jinja templates. But hey, in this approach, I'm seeing a lot of HTML duplication and less readability while rendering the forms, right? So to enable reusability of HTML in Jinja templates, there's a concept called macros. So macro is basically like a function in Python, but it's in Jinja. So I'm going to create a small macro. I'm just going to copy paste the macro here, which will render each form input. So this is a macro called render input. And if you don't know about macros, I've already created a video on Jinja macros. You can refer that video. I will leave the link of that video in the description if you don't know about Jinja macros. So this Jinja macro is like a function which takes in the label input and the name of the HTML form input and the type of the form input. And here you can see I've got the default type as text. And here I'm rendering a row for each form input inside the table. So I can use this render input instead of this complete row, and I'm rendering a label in one column, and in another column I'm rendering the errors and the main form input itself. And here the type is the input type which you've given in the macro, name is the name of the form input which I've supplied in the macro argument, and value is coming from the request.form, and the key is the name of the form input. And to render any extra attributes, I've used a for loop and iterating over the kw args special object inside this macro, so that I can provide additional attributes like minimum length, required, and so on. So let's try to remove this row and render using macro. So I'm writing render input, the label is name, and the name of the form input is username, and the type is text, and I'm giving extra attributes like minimum length equal to 4 and required equal to some blank string. So I can totally eliminate this row now. I've just created a single line to render a name input, and the same way I'm going to copy paste this. I'm going to write this input is phone, and the name of this is user phone, and the type is a number, and minimum length is not required, but I'm going to have a max attribute as some 1 lakh and required equal to some blank string. So let's try to render the input for email. I can now eliminate this phone input, and here the name of the input is user email, and the type is email, and I don't require this max attribute, I'm just required. And now I can eliminate this email row also. So now using macros, I have eliminated repeatability and increased the readability of this form. So if you want to create your practical application, I highly recommend using macros so that you can reduce that HTML template repeatability and increase the readability and reduce human errors. Alright, let's try to see if it works. I'm going to save this template and go to the browser and reload it. It's rendered, and let's try to submit something and click submit. Yeah, I got some validation issue here. Instead of min, I've written max, so I'll just write min equal to 1 lakh, save it, and then click this again and write some name, some phone number, some email address, and click enter. The form is submitted, and inside the terminal I can even see the form data. Let's try to see our server side validation is working correctly or not. So I'm just gonna start it with some special character and click enter, and I'm getting another username should start with an alphabet. But here I'm not seeing the styling because I think I did a mistake in this macro. Here I got the class as form error. Instead I have to write the class as error. Save this and now reload this form again and enter some invalid name, some phone number, and some email. And now if I just submit the form, you can see the styling also. Now form is ready using macros. So that's it, guys. This is how you can render forms and perform server-side and front-end validation in Flask. You can see I've created a blog post on basic Flask forms and performing front-end and server-side validation in Flask web applications. And I've even given you the source code so that you can copy paste and practice it for yourself. So please be sure to check out the link of this blog post in the description of this video. I've also given you the references for further reading for the Flask documentation and Jinja documentation. And before closing, I just want to say that there is better way to do server-side form validation instead of doing it all yourself by creating this error object and doing the form validation yourself. There is an awesome library called WT Forms where you can perform server-side validation very easily using this WT Forms module. And I will cover WT Forms in our next video so that you can easily perform server-side validations with less errors and more efficiency. Please feel free to use the comment section if you have any doubts or if you have any valuable feedback. Hope you like this video, guys. Thank you for watching.